الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم افتح إلينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. ونعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So what I want to do is, because it's a very broad topic, I thought I would just introduce the concept of the heart using Imam Al-Ghazali's كيمياء السعادة. And what I want to do is just the first two chapters after his muqaddimah. He talks about معرفة النفس, كيف تعرف نفسك, and حقيقة القلب. The more complex aspect of this topic is in his book عجائب القلب, The Marvels of the Heart, which is book number 21, I think, of the Ihya. And then he branches off into so that's the heart, and then there's the mind. He branches off into the mind, al-aql, in Mishkat al-Anwar, which is also its own topic by itself. Ghazali's كيمياء السعادة, the reason he wrote this book, The Alchemy of Happiness is what he calls it. He wants to primarily look at the heart as the fundamental core aspect of the human being, and how this human being, through his heart, can attain eternal happiness. Not just the happiness or the fleeting joy of this world, but eternal sa'ada, and how he can avoid eternal shiqa, that eternal punishment, or the thing that would grieve the soul or put it in a state of anxiety and constant agitation. So what he does is, because that's the core aspect of his study, is how do you actually seek out happiness. He doesn't focus too much on the components themselves. Rather, he focuses more on how best you can utilize these components for that pursuit. So he only introduces the concepts in the beginning to give you a brief understanding of what he is talking about, and the more detailed science of it is to be found in The Marvels of the Heart. Even then, Ghazali's style is that he doesn't focus too much on particularities. He always speaks in universals. And he believes that if you understand the universal, then you can use usul and your understanding of fiqh to refine the particulars in their given circumstances as and when they are needed. So other scholars focus on particulars as well, and they expand more on those aspects. So those are scholars like Ibn Sina with his Metaphysics, which also has quite a number of problems. So you really need to be a student of philosophy and metaphysics to understand and recognize the issues that are there with Ibn Sina's metaphysics, which Ghazali in his Maqasid al-Falasifa elaborates the good things that philosophers do, and then in his Tahafut al-Falasifa he says this is where they're going wrong, and he focuses a lot on the metaphysical aspects, because those are the sciences that you can't actually see and touch and feel to come to a proper ratification that is solid, like a truth that is tawatur, like it's known by everyone, a fact. Because it's metaphysical, everyone has a different understanding, and you can't actually see these metaphysical things. So there are a lot of problems with metaphysics, and a lot of wrong conclusions can be drawn if the science itself is not pursued in the proper way, with the proper methodology and the proper requisite knowledges to pursue them. Language is a key proponent of that as well, because the Quran does give you metaphysical concepts, but you have to understand them and interpret those concepts. Anything metaphysical has to be interpreted. There is always an element of mithal attached to that. So the Quran, Allah says it himself, he uses these metaphors and mithal to elaborate things that we don't actually see in our own physical sight. Like when he says Allahu nuru samawati wal ard, how do you understand that nur? And he says, Mathalu nurihi. He's giving you an example of that light. And the components that he gives you are components of this world. They are not components of that world. Anything that is in this world doesn't necessarily mean it has the same attributes as that other world, in shape or size or color or texture or any other relative element that describes a component of this world. But we use these components to help us understand those components. So he says, Mathalu nurihi kamishkat, he says, like the niche. And then misbah, like the lamp. And then zujaja, like the glass. Kawkab, like the star. Shajara, like the tree. Zaytuna, like the olive. And then in the end he says, وَيَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ الْأَمْثَالَ لِلنَّاسِ. Allah uses these allegories for the sake of mankind's understanding, because he knows that while you're in this world, you can only see this world. You can't see the other world. And the only way you can relate with that other world is through these metaphors. And these metaphors have to be interpreted. And therefore language, which is where symbol meets reality, language really needs to be refined, especially in the language used to present the metaphor. So if it's Arabic, then an individual's Arabic really has to be refined to that excellence to be able to interpret that metaphor correctly. It cannot be done through a translation, which I believe is where a lot of people make mistakes in their interpretive aspects, because one thing might seem literal in one language, but it's rhetorical in another language, or metaphorical in a third language. So that can create a lot of confusion and result in a lot of mistakes if the language is not refined. Likewise, everything or every science is the tool that will help you reach the truth. Every science in this regard has what's known as a had. So in the Islamic sciences, every science has got 10 principles. They are known as Mabadi'a Ashara. One of these, the first of these, is called the had. And the had is the terms of that science that define the science, and the hudud of that science, where the boundaries or the parameters or the limits lie. And this is because the truth also has a limit. The truth is not blanket, or it's not just flexible or fluid that can flow in and out of anything. It's defined because it is the truth. It is absolute. It cannot have weak points. It has to be solid and defined. And therefore, the instrument that helps arrive at the truth also has to be defined. And it has to have parameters and boundaries. Now, of each science, there are rules, and then there are exceptions to the rule. And the rules of one science cannot be applied to the rules of another science. Very rarely will they overlap, especially in the particularities between the sciences. In the universal aspects, you can apply the same universals because the universals don't change, but the particularities can change. So what you experience in the physical world, if you're going to apply it to the metaphysical world, then you have to use metaphoric language. You cannot use the same principles and apply them to that other world as well. Now, so like I said, there are rules, and then there are exceptions to the rule. The exceptions to the rule are applied on top of the rule. They don't form the foundation of the rules. And I'll give you an example. In this world, compared to the metaphysical worlds, this world has got 3 components. Things that are necessary, they have to happen, or they have to be, or they have to occur. They are necessary. They are what are called wajibat. And then things that are possible or have possibilities. These are known as mumkin or mumkinat. And then there are things that are impossible, that are definitely not going to happen or just cannot be. And these are called mustahliyat. So the same case doesn't apply to the metaphysical world. There are things that are wajibat in the metaphysical realms. There are things that are possible in the metaphysical world, but there are no impossibilities in the metaphysical realm. It's a world of pure possibilities because everything is truth. The lie or the variance to the possibility is a phenomenon of this world. It does not transcend into the other worlds. So you cannot have falsehood in the samawat. The falsehood is of this world. And that falsehood is a fabrication from something that already exists as the truth. Which is why at the heart of every lie, there is a truth. At the heart of every deception, there is a truth. It might be a subjective truth, a factual truth, an objective truth, but there is always going to be a truth somewhere in there, right? And so you can't apply the same rules of necessities and possibilities and impossibilities of this world to that other world, because the necessities of that world are not the same as this. But we can use the necessities of this world to understand that other world. So, for instance, mankind, human beings cannot fly. That's an impossibility on the human being. The human being cannot fly, but there's an exception to that rule. And we would say that the exception is that the human being can fly with the use of an instrument. So the exception comes on top of the rule itself. Mankind, or a human being by himself, without any assistance, cannot fly. Unless or except when he has an instrument to help him fly. Are you guys following me? Any questions on that?
No, that's what I would say.
Okay. So the reason why I'm saying that is because when we're looking at things like...
I have a question.
Yeah.
I only caught a part from the beginning, but there's a question that I have related to that part.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You said for each science there are rules, and those rules that are applied for that science cannot be crossed over to another science.
Mm-hmm.
What about in the science of language?
Let me
give an example with it.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a quick example, the Hebrew word.
Mm-hmm.
We go from a Hebrew word into a practical reality that exists.
Go on.
I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, so going from a Hebrew word, like saying that, looking at the science of language, right?
Mm-hmm.
And seeing if the meanings that exist in a previous language applies in reality.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, because I guess I need to give an example for this. So, for example, this word COVID backwards is dovah. In Hebrew, it means possession.
Mm-hmm.
But in Arabic, we know that's not possession. What is they consider COVID is not necessarily possession, or is it? That's my question.
Okay.
Basically, that's something that can't be referenced in Arabic.
Right.
But in Hebrew, it can.
Okay, so just to use that as an example then. So the science of language is a science by itself. That's the universal element that studies language. And you can apply that science to any language. And any language will have rhetoric, will have logic, and will have grammar. So those are the three sciences of language. And you can apply the same three to any language. Now, within each language, each one will have its own rules. It'll have its own grammatical rules and its own logic system, more or less, and it will have its own rhetoric. You cannot apply the same rhetoric in Arabic to English, or the same grammatical rules of Hebrew to Arabic. So the same rules do not apply, but the universal concept of having a science in that language, that can be applied. That every language has got these three sciences and can have many more sciences tertiary to that. When it comes to the example that you used, COVID and Dovak, or Dovik, or Divok, how am I pronouncing that? Backwards, right?
I haven't heard the pronunciation. I thought it was Dovak, but I don't know. I haven't heard it.
Okay, so in the science of language, the way you would look at that is that primarily, what is the origin of the word COVID? And this is now going into the science of sarf, or etymology. Now, the rules of etymology in Arabic are different from the rules of etymology in Hebrew, and also different from the rules of etymology in English. Because these are the three that we're looking at, right? In Arabic, they use the three-letter root word system. And the rules of etymology follow, have to go also hand in hand with the inflection of the language. It's easier to look up root word etymologies in Arabic as compared to Hebrew, because the Hebrew language, even though uses the same trilateral root word system, a lot of their literature, insofar as the science is concerned, has been lost because they never preserved their works. However, in English, you can't use the same etymology or the same science. Etymology is a science because English itself doesn't have a root system. English is a collective of words from different root systems. So you have to examine and see exactly where does this word in English, COVID, where does its etymology come from? Does it come from a Latin source, a Greek source, a Germanic source, a French source? Is it an Old English word? Does it have any Celtic origins or Viking origins? Does it have any Anglo-Saxon origins? You have to really examine exactly where it's being traced from. And then based on that root system is when you would compare the root systems of the two languages, Hebrew, and then or the root word in Hebrew, and then the root word in the English origin of that word, and see if the meanings are related. Then you would be able to show that there is a connection between the two. But simply switching the word around, like switching COVID around, doesn't imply that it has the same meaning in Hebrew.
So would I be wrong to say that the Hebrew language is the language that is used for the Kabbalah, and there's rules that are specific for that language, and rules that are specific for the practice of sin?
Yes, you're correct in that, because when it comes to the actual application of language, each categorical application will have its own rules. So you use English and apply it in physics, then the science of physics will have its own use of the language in that science. So a term in physics doesn't necessarily mean the same in legislation, for instance. Even though they might have the same dictionary definition, but then in the subjective field, it has its own rules.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. If you want to break, we can break and then carry on after that. Or if there's any other question, because I don't want to interrupt the actual reading of the text.
Yeah, I apologize about the interruption.
No worries, no, it's not an interruption. no.
Because that question it came up in relation to what you were saying, because the rules of the science of the languages of the sciences is very important, and that's actually kind of the gist of what I think we needed to cover. Just even for this session, just to ponder on, because I got a lot from that.
So we were on talking about impossibilities and exceptions.
Okay, so just briefly to finish up on that element, the reason why I was saying is that the rules don't apply is because then when we're talking about elements of this world in exemplification of the other world, even though we're using them metaphorically, it doesn't mean that they are actually the same. Like if we say grapes in Jannah, they don't necessarily mean that they have the same shape or definition or even taste or smell or any other factor attributed to them as the grapes of this world. It's basically used as an example because we can't actually conceptualize it. We cannot comprehend that right now until on that day when the veils have been lifted, right? And our eyes, our gaze is more piercing. So when Allah says about the fragrance of Jannah, the sense of smell or the actual concept of smell is not the same as this nose in this world. We don't actually smell it the way we smell things in this world. Because the concept is there. The universality doesn't change. The particular is different. So the particulars of this world don't apply to the same particulars of that world, but we can use them to understand that other realm. And this is essentially what knowledge entails. It's going into the ibar. It's going past the particularities of a thing to go into the innermost aspect of the thing and draw out an understanding of it. So once you understand the universality of it, it doesn't matter what particular is in front of you, you can understand and comprehend it. So if you look at any tree in the world, doesn't matter where you are, you know it's a tree. It doesn't puzzle you, it doesn't confuse you. You're not wondering what the hell this thing is, even though it's a different species altogether. It might even be a different color, a different height, or a different thickness, or a different anything. But it's the universality of it that you have comprehended, and therefore you're able to understand it, even though the particular is different. So everything that we're looking at is we're trying to understand the universality of the thing.
But isn't that connected to the symbol or the shape of the thing? Because when you think of a tree, you think of the shape of, you got the trunk and roots and the leafy top. So the shape is connected to the essence of the thing. Wouldn't that be true?
The shape, and this is goes into logic, the shape is known as an arad. So you've got in material logic, you've got the five predicables: the genus, the species, the differentia, the specific, and the arad, the event or the phenomenon of it. And then from that, there are 10. You have the substance, the color, the shape, the texture, the time, the place, and all those particularities that define that specificity. So that's all part of the phenomenal aspect. The shapes that we are accustomed to, the square, the rectangle, the triangle, goes back deep into philosophy. I think even Euclid is in way back, before even Socrates, I believe, came to try and figure out what exactly is a triangle. Like, what makes a triangle a triangle? Why is there a square? Why is there a circle? Because these are universal shapes. But they don't necessarily apply to the metaphysical realm, because the metaphysical realm is not a realm of matter and material that can come together to make the shapes that we have come to know through observation of actual matter that can take that shape. So we would look at something that is in nature already and see a particular shape. And that's because matter has come together. Allah has created it that way to take that particular shape. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the same shapes will be there in the metaphysical realms. However, the concept of shape itself is universal. So there will be things that have shapes, but not necessarily the triangle or the square or the rectangle. There might be shapes that are beyond our comprehension.
So, CD, I got a question, right?
Yeah.
This was with regards to education. Right now, when we have children who study, it seems like from what you're saying, we're doing it backwards.
Yeah.
We teach the children shapes, squares, triangles, etc.
Yeah.
And then after that, we kind of let them out into the world. So, are we doing it backwards?
We're doing it backwards, yeah. So this is one of the issues. I think Saleh will know this better than me in terms of education. We're basically teaching our children particularities instead of giving them universals and helping them understand universals. And that's a big issue, because a lot of children are losing the ability to abstract universals from the world around them. And that's because they're constantly being bombarded with all these images and stupid songs and all these things that they put out, on their so-called education curriculums. But they're not actually helping them abstract reality and helping their imaginative faculties understand the universal aspects. So we're just telling them this is a square. That's it. Why it's a square, where it's come from, how it came to be, you don't need to know that.
And that last thing you said before you talked about the Greek scholars, Dr. Khalifah, you said you named a list of a subject. You named a list of subject matter before before you were talking about the Greek philosophers. I forget what we were talking about. It was after you were talking about the
Oh,
Greek
Alif, you have to let in Abu Hamza. You're the host now, yeah.
There we go.
Thank you.
The subject. So, yeah, Ghazali talks about the briefs, like the concepts, but the specific subjects would be either metaphysics in general, or ilm al-nafs in particular, so psychology, and then that would be like scholars like Fakhruddin al-Razi, al-Farabi, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. They were more like psychologists, specialists in that field. And that now goes into the subject aspect of the disorders, the traumas, the complexes that the self can experience externally or internally. Ghazali focuses more on the diseases of the heart. So he's more of from a spiritual perspective. But the same scientific concepts apply. So Abu Zayd al-Balkhi was an amazing psychologist. He wrote a book which I studied with Dr. Malik Badri. In fact, he translated that book. I don't know if I have it here. I don't know where it is. I think it's downstairs. He showed, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi showed how every disorder that was known at his time, or inferiority complex, or traumatic experience, can ultimately be traced back to a disease of the heart or a combination of diseases. And he theorized that if you can fix those diseases at their root cause, then you will fix the actual psychological problem that a person is going through, or the mental state of that individual. But there are some psychological aspects that Ghazali even talks about. He talks about a little bit about it in here, and more about it in the Ajaib al-Qalb and the book on Nafs. And before him, the Greeks also had a similar theory. Aristotle is known for having developed the three dimensions, inner dimensions of the psyche, or the soul. Psyche in Greek is soul, or is nafs in Arabic. The irascible soul, the concupiscent soul, and the rational soul, which Ghazali calls the quwa ghadabiyya, quwa shahwaniyya, and quwa aqaliyya.
One second, Nasiri. Is this being recorded or when I don't record this one?
Oh, I gave the host to Alif. I thought he was recording.
Okay.
What was those three types of souls?
So Ghazali calls it ghadabiyya. Ghadab is anger, and he calls it that because anger is the lowest, most blameworthy aspect of the emotion, and the highest being mawadda, or love, and then shahwa being the lowest, most blameworthy aspect of the desire, which is essentially greed. And the highest of the desire is the desire to know God or to do good. The lowest desire is to desire to satisfy the self. And then aqaliya has got two aspects as well. The lowest is jahiliya, complete ignorance, and the highest is knowledge, or excellence in knowledge. And then Ghazali introduced a fourth component in that, and he called it adala, or justice. And that also has a highest point and a lowest point. The lowest point is oppression or injustice, and then the highest point is justice itself, to judge or establish sound governance within the self, where hikmah is its strongest weapon. So when the mind that has knowledge at its highest peak applies wisdom, is able to regulate the self's emotions and control them, and the desires and control them. And in doing so, it will have justice within the self. I think that would be a better.
That relates to what Prophet not the Prophet. Well, Allah talked about Prophet Dawood and about justice. That little story about the two brothers and the sheep and what they should do with it. Talks about justice.
No, that's a different kind of justice that Nabi Dawood received as a case to judge between two people who had a complaint. They were actually angels who came in disguise as men to test or put Dawood's judgment at test. And another incident happened with Suleiman. But those were adala in terms of the people in the communal sense. So there are two types of Khilafah that are mentioned in the Quran, and the two are very different. A lot of people confuse the two. The first one is with regards to Adam as human being. إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. I'm going to place in the earth a Khalifa. And then the second is with Nabi Dawood, إِنَّا جَعَلْنَاكَ خَلِيفَةً فِي الْأَرْضِ. The second one is to do with state and governance. The first one is to do with the human being himself as an individual. So the scholars say that that sort of Khilafah is to govern yourself in the right way, because Allah is not placing us a representative on earth to represent His sovereignty in terms of governance or law or legislation. He is sending a Khalifa who will best exemplify what Allah defines as truth and justice. And the primary begins with the self, with disciplining the self, because you can't go out disciplining others if you haven't disciplined yourself. And this can best be seen in a household whereby the father, who is the head of the household, cannot go about disciplining the children if he himself has bad habits, right? So father going around telling the child you shouldn't smoke and smoking is bad for you and A, B, C, D, but then the child just looks at him and says, well, why are you smoking then? Right? And that's an oxymoron. Well, how can you tell me about doing good when you yourself are not doing it? So the primary is to the self. You fix yourself, then you can go and fix others. And this is why he tells Dawood, فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَ النَّاسَ بِالْحَقِّ. Judge between the people with truth. And that legislation or that khilafah is for the people. It's a state governance, but it's secondary to first disciplining yourself. So when the individual has affirmed Tawheed, he has established his core beliefs, he is purifying himself, he is punctual in his actions and his worshipful acts, then he can get the authority to govern others. And the same case applies to even the fuqaha, it applies to the ulama, because you can't go out there doing jurisprudence and judging between people or passing fatwas when you yourself are not practicing it. And the Quran strongly warns against that. That they do things, I think it's in Surah As-Saff. كَبُرَ مَقْتًا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَن تَقُولُوا مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ. That the most hateful in the sight of Allah is that you speak or you say things, but you don't do them. Like you're telling others to do it, but you're not doing it yourself, because you're supposed to discipline yourself first and then go out and discipline others. So, Bismillah, Imam Al-Ghazali, in his, so after his Muqaddimah, the first chapter he calls it Faslu fi Ma'rifati Nafs. I'm not going to go through all the pages. I'm just going to highlight the few concepts that I think are important. The title of the book is كيمياء السعادة, the Alchemy of Happiness. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has done a really good job on this. He's done a full course on the whole book. They're like 5 lecture sessions. It's not a big book, and he wrote it. The Arabic is pretty simple to understand because, again, he was not going in the technicalities of it. He just wanted people to understand the inner dimensions of the self and the heart. So if you can find that lecture series, it's in audio only. Since you're on the road most of the time, it would be ideal for you to just listen to that. And if you get a chance, like, you can sit with the Arabic as well, because he goes through the text and he explains it. So the chapters that I'm going to look at, just in brief, is the first 3, فصل في معرفة النفس, and then فصل كيف تعرف نفسك, and حقيقة القلب. And that's it, and then inshallah we'll see if we can progress from there. So Bismillah, he says, اعلم أن مفتاح معرفة الله تعالى هو معرفة النفس. Know that the key to understanding your Lord, to understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is by understanding yourself. كما قال سبحانه وتعالى, as Allah says, سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. in Surah Fusilat. Now, it's very interesting. He starts off with that because if you look at that ayah, it's a very, very beautiful ayah. He says, Allah, we will show them our signs, fil afaqi, and afaq, ufuq, is the horizon. And this is, again, goes back to what I was saying about using what we can comprehend in reality to define what we cannot see. So the ufuq here is metaphoric. It is defining the horizon between the ard and the samawats. And you see this exemplification on the horizon, let's say out in the ocean or on a very flat landscape. When you're looking way out, you will see this thin slither of a line whereby it looks like the sky is almost touching the ground, but it doesn't actually touch the ground. There's like a thin partition in between. That's the ufuq. That's the in between, or what could be known as the gap or the breach in between. And that is the in between the ard as the material world and the samawat, the heavens. So he's saying we will show them the signs in the in between of these two. And where is the in between of these two best comprehended by the human being? It's the self. So he says, "Wafi anfusihim," and in themselves or in their selves. Now it's interesting. The pronoun here, hum. It's him because of the fi, but anfusahum, the hum, can be applied in both sense as a possessive pronoun or as a directive. So it can be said that themselves, or it can also mean their selves. So the selves can also be there. Usually in the Arabic, the dhamir mutakallim is the only pronoun in which you can distinguish between the two. So if you want to say antum, I would mean to you, or antuma, since if it's like two of you, antuma. So I would say something like, but if I want to say that something is done onto you, I would say alaykum, right? Assalamu alaykum. I change the pronoun from the tum, the ta, and I replace it with the ka. So now the salam is unto you. It is done to you as the subject, as the recipient, at which point you become the possessor of that. Compared to when I'm just speaking to you generally, to say, you guys, I'm not really giving you any possession of anything in that sense. So anfusihim here can mean themselves, or it can also mean their selves, and the more appropriate application is their selves, because it is in their selves. In the self is where you will see these signs. Are you with me?
In your mind.
Yeah, in the inner sight, and that's what Ghazali will describe and elaborate further on this point specifically.
I wanted to add, when you were talking about the horizon between the heavens and the dunya, I thought about the horizon, and the sun sets under the horizon. So couldn't that explain the hadith about the sun going under and bowing to his Lord.
That's, yeah,
Under heavens of the horizon.
that's right. Yeah. So when that came about, some of the modern contemporaries, they started arguing back and saying, "Oh, how is that possible? Now we know the Earth is round, the sun doesn't go anywhere, blah blah blah." But then a lot of good scholars argued that back, and they really threw it back in their face, and that's not what it means. This is how you understand it, that the sun is going down. So even that same case applies to Dhul Qarnayn's journey, where people are arguing, oh, there's a conflict in the Quran because how can the sun set in water? But that's not what it means, because it's from the point of observation, right? And the ancient peoples understood it from that point of observation. Nobody talked about the earth turning. Everyone talked about, even today, no one talks about an earth turn. Like, did you like that earth turn? Was it beautiful in the evening? No, no one talks about that. Everyone talks about sunrise and sunset. So, right. So, حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق, until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. The truth here, some of the ulama say, is in reference to the Quran, that the Quran is the truth. And others say that it actually entails all of reality, including the Quran, that all of reality, they come to realize the true reality. Now, the connection between the ufuq and the nafs is such that the nafs is not of this material world, but it's also not entirely spiritual. It's not the ruh. Even though in terms of the terms themselves, scholars will use that interchangeably depending on context. Ghazali will also use that somewhere along here, and we'll see that how he's used the terms interchangeably. But the nafs, the human being, now we're talking about, in English terms, we would say the id, the psyche itself, the identity, the person, is in a very unique position in between the body, which is of the earthly realm, and the ruh, which is of the samawat, of the spiritual realm, and the nafs is the in between the two. So we are in a very unique position in that we can comprehend both worlds. Animals cannot comprehend the other world, even though they have a soul, but their soul is not the same as the human soul. Animals cannot comprehend the other world, and that's because they're limited to this world. But we can comprehend both worlds. We can comprehend this material reality and that spiritual reality as well. The only problem is that our senses are limited to this reality, and we can't see or apply our senses to that other reality. So we only use components of this world as metaphors to define the other world, which is why when we talk about the heart, what pictures in our mind, because we can't actually see the spiritual heart, we picture the physical heart. When we talk about the mind, we picture this brain as an organ. So we're using components that we're familiar with to exemplify those components that we're not familiar with. Because how do you conceptualize spiritual sight or the inner eye? How do you conceptualize that? How do you conceptualize this seeing and the hearing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Even though he says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay," there is nothing in comparison to him or in likeness to him. And yet, وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, and yet, he is all seeing, all hearing. That wow there, wow atifa, is a unique wow. If you look at some of the translations, they've got it completely wrong. That wow, it doesn't mean and he is all seeing and all hearing. It says and yet he can see all and hear all. It is a conditional wow. And yet, despite nothing being like him, he can see everything and hear everything. But how do you conceptualize that? Because we're limited to this. We cannot see or observe what kind of sight that is or what kind of hearing that must be. Right? And that by itself should help us understand that wavelength and frequency, vibration, light intensity, photons, all these components that we're familiar with in physics, by which our senses interact, these don't exist in that world. They're not part of that realm. So we cannot talk about protons and neurons and neutrons and electrons and all these rons in that other world. We cannot talk about the soul having the same composition or material aspects as this world. And he's gonna talk about that and say about the heart as well in that regard, using the language that they used at that time. Any questions till there?
No animals have ruh. They just have nafs in the body.
No, they have ruh. So again, this goes into the science of the ruh itself, and everything has a ruh. Because it's Allah who the ruh is from His amr, and He's the one who brings things to life. So the scholars say that the ruh is the animus, or the thing that animates or brings to life, and he uses that term as well. And Ibn Khaldun also uses that term. He calls it ar-ruh al-hayawani. Sorry?
They have nafs. Is that the one that they don't have?
No, they have a nafs as well, and they have a ruh as well. And the ruh is what makes them alive, but their nafs is limited in its capabilities and powers. So they have the same emotions, they have desires, and they also have an intellect. But if you compare that to the human being, their intellect is limited and their emotions are uncontrollable because the limitation on the intellect, and the desires are also uncontrolled because of that limitation. But the human being has an advantage over them because we share the same emotions, we share the same desires. But because we have an intellect, we are able to regulate and control those emotions and desires. And that's what gives us a higher maqam than animals. But they have the same spirit, or they have a spirit. They have a ruh, not the ruh. There's a difference between ar-ruh and then ruh in the ma'rifah state and the nakira state, the definite and indefinite forms. In the definite form, the ruh is something very specific, and the Quran uses that sentence in a few parts. And then a ruh is something that is completely different for each and every object in creation. So animals do have a spirit, and man has a different kind of spirit. This also comes in from the Quran that Allah breathed into mankind of His own ruh. وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, from my ruh. So it's kind of special in that regard. It is also what gives the human being the unique attributes of being a human being, and also explains what the scriptures mean. The Bible says it. The hadith also contains that Allah created man in His own image. What does that mean? It doesn't mean in his form or his natural structure. Right? So we don't look like God. That's not what it means. It means that in attribution. So He's merciful, all merciful, and mankind can also be merciful in attribution. He is the truth, and mankind can also be truthful in attribution. But we're limited, and He is boundless. So we can have those kinds of attributions. And again, He also talks about those attributions also.
Can you round up the beginning, the four types of nafs? You said the one that's angry, the one that has desire, you said the awliya, or the rational. Also something about justice. What was?
Okay, so the ghadab, the quwa ghadabiyya. The ghadab is ghain dad ba, ghadab. And then shahwa is sheen, ha, waw, and then ta, the marbuta, the closed ta at the end, not the open one. And then aqaliya or aqal, you can just use aqal, ayn, qaf, lam. And then there's adala, ayn, dal, ada, alif, and lam, and then ta at the end, closed. Adala. So that's justice. So aqal is the intellect, ghadab is the emotion or anger, shahwa is the desire. All right. So going back to the text, then he says, وَقَالَ النَّبِيُّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ مَنْ عَرَفَ نَفْسَهُ فَقَدْ عَرَفَ رَبَّهُ. Now this is a debatable point in hadith literature, hadith science. Scholars argue that it is not a sahih hadith. In fact, some even argue that it's not a hadith at all because there's no attributed chain of narration or anything. It's most commonly found among philosophers who use it and the traditional Sufi who used it. Ghazali is, I think, using it from both those angles. He's not using this as a hukm or a fiqh, a sharia or a shari'i point. He's using it because its meaning is sound, and I agree to use it for that intent and purpose only, but not as a hadith to say this is exactly what it entails. If you come to know yourself, now you know all about God. That's not what he means, and this is what he explains here, is that if you know yourself, or whosoever knows his self knows his Lord. So he says, وَلَيْسَ شَيْءٌ أَقْرَبَ إِلَيْكَ مِن نَفْسِكَ فَإِذَا لَمْ تَعْرِفَ نَفْسِكَ فَكَيْفَ تَعْرِفَ رَبَّكَ. If you don't know yourself, how are you going to know your Lord? If you don't even know who you are, why you exist, why you have all these attributions and these weaknesses and fix those weaknesses, how are you going to come to know your Lord? Right? It's a logical statement that he's drawing. That if you don't even know why you are or why you exist, you've got no business arguing whether or not God exists. And that's all the atheists and nihilists and all the ists running around with their underwear on their head shouting there's no God. But that's the point here. If you don't understand yourself and understand why you've been created, how are you going to know the Creator himself? So he says, فَإِن قُلْتَ إِنِّي أَعْرَفُ نَفْسِكَ إِنِّي أَعْرَفُ نَفْسِي. If you say that I know myself, فَإِنَّمَا تَعْرِفُ الْجِسْمُ الظَّاهِرُ. What you're talking about is you just know your outward form, your body. التي هو اليد والرجل والرأس وكذلك. These are your hands and your feet and your limbs and your organs and your body parts and all those things. ولا تعرف ما في باطنك من الأمر إذا غضبت الطلبة وإذا اشتهيت طلبة النكاح. Okay, so he's giving examples here. He's saying that doesn't mean you know yourself in the inward sense, in the inward reality. All you're talking about is the general algorithmic aspect of your body. So when you have a sexual desire, you go looking for a partner. He's using diplomatic terms here. He's using the term nikah just because it's more sanitary, but that's the general idea. If you're hungry, you go look out for food. If you are thirsty, you look for water, right? وَالدَّوَابُ تُشَرِّكُكَ فِي هَذِهِ الْأُمُورِ. The beasts and the animals, they share these qualities with you. So how are you any different than an animal if that's the rationale behind you knowing yourself? Then he goes into the details of the different elements. I think we can cover this another time because he talks about the different aspects of the Baha'im, the Saba'a, the Shayateen, the Malaika, the likeness of these different elements comparatively. So I think we'll do that on another day because it's going more detail into that particular aspect. Yeah, so let's go to the next chapter. فَصْلُ كَيْفَ تَعْرِفُ نَفْسَكَ. Is there any question on that up until there before we pick this? I think we have about 8 minutes to go before we have to take a break.
So I just wanted to ask can you guys hear me first of all clearly?
Yeah.
All right. So when Allah SWT talks about the void that is between the horizon, that little space, that space Allah SWT is akinning that to the nafs, you're saying?
No, he's in that ayah. You're speaking about the ayah in context.
Yes.
No, it's not in that sense. Sanurihim ayatina fil afaqi, in the horizons between the two planes, and in their selves. So the likeness of the position of the self is the likeness of that space in between.
Oh, okay. So it's
Yeah.
similar to it. It's not the
Yeah.
actual.
It's not the actual thing. It's like in similitude. The horizon is where the human being is. So we are in between. We're not fully material and we're not fully spiritual either. And this is also unique in the human being's respect, that we have to we are in the process of becoming, and this is another really deep subject on its own, understanding existence itself. But the aspect of fayakun, there's kun and then there's fayakun, it becomes. So we're in the process of becoming until the finality of our term individually, when we become something, either something that is angelic in nature or something that is demonic in nature. And the demonic aspects are the lower aspects of this material world. So we either become materialists or we become spiritual. We either incline towards the body or we incline towards the ruh, or the inclinations of the ruh. Uh-huh. I think Alif had a question.
I'm just looking over the notes and seeing if anything. Okay, you said something about language being important because the next life, the language of that place or how everything is arranged, it's so bizarre or different that you will need basically an intellect to basically even understand what's going on, or a high spiritual intellect to understand, So I'll just, can you elaborate on that again and how shapes were connected to, like, because if you speak about language, then language is connected to symbols in your head, like your mental images, right? And I was thinking about earlier today, I was watching this video about this person talking about jinn possession and basically how they can speak to the person, showing images in their head,
Mhm.
but it's their language is how they speak is like their language is sound that turns into images, and it's like, isn't that connected to, if it's in their mental image and the mind is the soul, it's like a soul image. That means, and they were talking about the person possessed, or like on psychedelics, that the jinn jump in their bodies, then jump out and like play with them, and like their whole nature is so like childish, like super like childish love kind of.
They're seeing
It's
things.
like,
They're like hallucinating
yeah,
things. They're seeing images. Language has got two aspects, two primary aspects: the created form and then the essential form. The created form is what we have in the outward sense, and that's got three components. Which, when you go to learn a language, they'll tell you that three components are reading, listening, and speaking. And so you've got your eyes, your tongue, and your ears as the primary senses that engage with that outward aspect, the created form. The created form can take any shape and form. And this is why, we're used to modern languages whereby we're looking at words. But in essence, what these are, each one is a symbol. And so you've got all these different symbols that come together: A, B, C, D. These are all symbols. And they form together to form signs. So each word is a sign. And so we say that a sign, by its nature, doesn't point to itself. It never points to what it is. It always points to something else. So it's representing. So every symbol represents something else. In the traditional languages where you had cuneiform or runic forms or hieroglyphic forms, you had different shapes and figures that came together, and these symbols had some meaning that people could comprehend, and that it is that meaning that the symbol represents. So in the world of creation, everything is a symbol by itself. I am a symbol that represents my inner reality. So it represents who I am. So when you see this face, this handsome face, what you're looking at is Astaghfirullah. You're looking at AbuBilaal, like, so you can recognize who I am by this symbol, by this face. If I change this, if I alter this symbol, let's say I shave my beard, astaghfirullah, you might not recognize me.
I was just about to ask you something, like these patients, some of them, when I see them, like some of them look so scary, and like when they tell me their diagnosis, then it makes sense based on what they look like. It's just like yesterday I had just all EDPs all day, emotionally disturbed patients, and it was just very, hard day. So yeah, continue.
So the language that you're referring to is the inward language. Now that inward language, because it's in a realm where the physical elements don't exist, how do you draw a picture in your mind? You don't have a pen. How do you have a pen in your mind? How do you actually define those thoughts? What shape, form, construct, or composition, material aspect do the thoughts take? They don't have a material aspect. Emotions don't have a material aspect. So how do you elaborate what those are? If I ask you how you're feeling, you'll actually give it a thought for a moment. I mean, a lot of times in conventional speech, people will just say, yeah, I'm doing good, I mean, it's just almost instinctive to say that. But if I actually ask you with a deep connection, how you feeling, you will actually take a moment to think it out, because you want to know how are you going to actually execute that feeling or that emotion. So you construct an understanding of those with words, with the symbols, and the symbols are what represent the thought itself. So that when they're executed, we have a common understanding of what those symbols mean. So that the meaning of what you want to be meant can be conveyed to me. And I can understand your inward reality. And so that can be represented in shape, form, color, texture, intensity, or any other aspect. Whether it's words on paper, or it's a statue, or it's an object, or whatever it might be, can be used to represent something else in speech. And that can be fabricated in the mind, is what the jinn would sometimes do if they possessed someone. Or that's exactly how generally you would think things out intellectually. I think let's take a break here, inshallah, and then we can carry on in the next section. I want to do the second chapter, كيف تعرف نفسك. So let's take a break, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, rabbil alamin. Salatu salam.